I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey, Lickers, welcome to the next installment of our Stab and Gab Sunday true crime episode. This episode is about the murder of Holly Blake in 1991. This is a murder that I have a loose connection with. I lived next door to Holly's ex-husband about 15 years after the murder, which is how I learned of her murder in the first place. And since starting a more regular true crime segment on the podcast, it was one that I definitely wanted to look into. And it turned out to be a doozy. So let's get into it. Holly Blake was 28 years old in September of 1991. She was 5 foot 6 inches tall, 120 pounds, and had shoulder-length blonde hair. She was a waitress at Spangler's restaurant in Gettysburg. I have determined that that is now called the Hunterstown Diner at the truck stop right off of Route 15, at the Hunterstown exit onto 394 and Business 15. Shout out to my sister for asking the waitresses there while we were having dinner there one evening. Friends and family and co-workers described her as energetic, friendly, and athletic. She was said to be a good-hearted person and devoted mother to her 2 young girls. Holly and her husband Bernie met in California. They moved to Gettysburg, where they married in 1981. They ended up divorcing, but her ex-husband Bernie moved back in with her after suffering a broken leg and a motorcycle accident that put him out of work. On her employment application, she described her ex as a bum. I'll just say she wasn't lying. Bernie Blake, her ex, claimed that they were working to reconcile. I'm not sure that I believe that. I think he believed that, but I don't know that that was actually what was going on. On September 26, 1991, Holly Blake told her ex, Bernie, that she was going to pick up her check from work, wash and wax her car, and meet up with a friend at a restaurant called the Distelfink. The Distelfink is located down the road from Spangler's. It was a pretty cool place to go. I've been there several times in the past while out investigating the battlefield. Holly tells her ex she's going to the Distelfink and that she would be back in a few hours. They had also made plans to go apple picking with their daughters later that afternoon. That was the last time her ex saw her. She didn't return home. When Holly didn't come home, Bernie started calling all her friends, the hospitals, and the police. He couldn't file a missing person report until 24 hours had passed. Police looked into it, and they found her vehicle at the Distelfink. Employees there said they saw her getting into a beige Subaru station wagon of her own free will. She grabbed a couple of things out of her car and drove off with the man in the other car. The Subaru she got into had Tennessee plates. Police were able to trace the car and the driver to the state of Georgia. The owner was a man named James Howard Van Meter. He told police he met Holly Blake at Spangler's when she was waitressing, and they made plans to meet on the 26th at the Distelfink. Van Meter told investigators that he dropped Holly off at a Gettysburg convenience store, specifically the Sheetz store, not long after picking her up at the restaurant. He said he saw her getting into a red Pontiac Firebird. Her ex-husband was quoted as saying, "He's swearing he dropped her off, but this I can't believe. She would have called. It just doesn't look good right now." Holly had made future plans, not only with her children, but also with someone to attend a support group for divorcees the Thursday after she went missing. So her ex, Bernie Blake, was right. It didn't look good. James Howard Van Meter was 35 years old and grew up in York and Adams counties in south central Pennsylvania, where I currently live. Van Meter was a high school dropout who didn't make it past the 10th grade. He was a drifter known for living in his car. Most recently, he lived in East Berlin, Pennsylvania with his parents. He was self-employed as a tree trimmer, and at one time he worked for Pennington Tree Experts for about a week. Interestingly, Holly Blake worked at a bar owned by Jim Pennington, who was the owner of Pennington Tree Experts. He was married at one time, but divorced and had 2 sons. He had a younger brother named John who rented a farmhouse and worked on a farm in northern Carroll County, Maryland. Police interviewed the brother, who said he asked James Van Meter how his date went, and James said he never went. During the investigation, police learned that James Van Meter was also a suspect in a kidnapping and rape in Pennsylvania that occurred 2 weeks before Holly went missing. Then, on October 6th, James Van Meter decided to come clean. He told police that he picked Holly Blake up at the Distelfink, and they drove out to the place his brother rented in Maryland. He parked the car and they got out and walked a bit. They kissed, then began walking again until they reached their final stop. There they fondled each other, and Holly ended up making a derogatory comment about his manhood. James Van Meter took offense to what she said and grabbed her and started strangling her. He had her in a death hold for 4 minutes, then checked to see if she was dead. He then dragged her body down a hill and concealed her under leaves. He went back to his car and went through her things and decided to burn her body. He said he tied her to a pyre, burned her, and scattered the remains along a creek. He camped in the woods that night and left the next day. After confessing, Van Meter took investigators to the area where he killed and cremated her. He said the body went up like a match. Police were able to recover remains in the 2 locations James indicated. One investigator said, "There was not anything large we could identify as human. I believe they found teeth." But before Maryland could prosecute James Van Meter, Pennsylvania needed to prosecute him for the rape and kidnapping that occurred there. On September 15, 1991, just 2 weeks before Holly was murdered, Van Meter, dressed in combat fatigues, broke into a Mennonite woman's home and kidnapped her at knife point. He forced her into his car, tied her hands, and drove to a campground along the Conewago Creek. There he cut off her nightgown and raped her 3 times with a knife held at her neck. During the rapes, the woman told James Van Meter that she had compassion for him and prayed to God to forgive him. It was believed that he spared her life because she prayed for him. He later wrote her a letter that she read during trial that said if she didn't forgive him for repeatedly raping her, she and her children would be in danger. He said specifically, "You're in real trouble." When his car was searched, they found orange rawhide shoelaces used to bind the woman and a 2-foot-long Bowie knife he used to threaten her with. Van Meter attempted to claim insanity. A Hershey psychiatrist who interviewed Van Meter called him actively psychotic. Prosecutors said his alleged psychosis was a farce put on for doctors. He was declared competent to stand trial. During his testimony, Van Meter said, "You know, my mind kept telling me, go for it. Nothing was ever intentional with me. It's just that time someone just told me to go. Go for it. Go for it. You know, go out and do crime like that. You know, I guess go break into somebody's house and kidnap somebody." He was found guilty of the rape and kidnap and was sentenced to 13 to 26 years in prison in Pennsylvania. It was now Maryland's turn, but Pennsylvania was dragging their feet, sending him down for trial. It took the intervention of the Maryland and Pennsylvania governors to have him extradited. Finally, his trial for first-degree murder started in 1993. Unfortunately, though he received a guilty verdict, The conviction was overturned on appeal. In Maryland, there is something known as the Hicks Rule, which requires a defendant to be brought to trial 180 days after they have secured counsel and counsel files intent to represent the accused. Because Pennsylvania dragged their feet and the district attorney did not file a waiver, James Van Meter was essentially getting away with murder. Angry over this, the district attorney sent in a letter to the editor of the local paper that read, "I watched James Van Meter describe to Corporal Doug Whalen the manner in which he strangled Holly Blake, as he stood on the spot where she died. His manner was serious but matter of fact, like a motorist describing a fender bender accident. As he spoke, he stared into Corporal Whalen's eyes and never blinked or looked away as one would expect a person of normal emotions would do. He had done a thorough job of destroying her remains and erasing the remains of the fire he used for that purpose." The district attorney lost his election over not filing the waiver for the Hicks Rule. Despite the fact that James Van Meter would be serving prison in Pennsylvania for the kidnap and rape of the East Berlin woman, those involved in the murder case of Holly Blake were not satisfied. The case was turned over to federal prosecutors because the state could no longer pursue a murder charge. The U.S. attorney tried him for a kidnapping charge. During the second trial, it was learned that James Van Meter had been staying at the 30 West Motel in Gettysburg, and the day he met Holly at the Distelfink, he checked out. The prosecutor pointed out that if you plan to hook up with a woman, why would you give up your hotel room with a warm, comfy bed? You'd give up your hotel room if you plan to rape and murder someone because the screams would be heard by others in the hotel. During the trial, Van Meter solicited another inmate to kill and rape the woman he raped in Pennsylvania because she was testifying against him in this federal case. He even gave him a map to her location. It was learned during trial that Van Meter burned Holly Blake's body for 11 hours. His ex-girlfriend provided investigators with over 100 letters James Van Meter had written to her. One letter said that he lied to police about the reason he killed Holly. Another letter said he killed Holly and raped the other woman because of his rage against women and frustration that he and his girlfriend broke up. The federal case for kidnapping was built around one small piece of evidence found at the scene of the fire. A set of handcuff keys were found hanging on a tree branch where Holly's body was burned. It was argued that it showed Holly was held against her will because there were no other explanations for handcuff keys to be found in a secluded area of woods on private property. The prosecutor also questioned the excuse that Van Meter flew into a rage over a comment about the size of his genitals because a nude photo of James Van Meter was provided by his ex-girlfriend, disproved that explanation. That photograph belies any notion that Holly Blake would have made a comment about the size of the defendant's penis, said Assistant U.S. Attorney Hughes. I guess he was well endowed. In 1996, James Van Meter was found guilty of kidnapping Holly Blake and received life in prison. He lost his subsequent appeal. He was described as being rotten to the core, and jurors said they thought he was pure evil. My personal impression of James Van Meter and the two cases is that this man was well on his way to being a serial killer. I believe that he made plans to meet Holly Blake, and his intention was to rape and kill her, not to just fool around. He only let the Mennonite woman live because she was praying for him. I think he learned the lesson that if he let them live, they could testify against him. I don't think he would have stopped with Holly. I looked into the area where the murder of Holly Blake took place. I found the address of James Van Meter's brother and discovered the location where he said he took her body to burn. Just so you know, I'm not only loosely connected because I live next to Holly's ex-husband, I'm also loosely connected because I grew up about 10 minutes from where he killed and burned her. Several years ago, myself and friends decided to go on an impromptu ghost hunt at a bridge located about 15 minutes from my parents' house. I had never been to the bridge before, but we went out in search of it. We found a bridge, one with a metal grate flooring, and while there, we heard a car coming. We moved off the bridge to get out of the way, listening to the car drive over the metal grates, but when the car was nearing our location where we would be able to see it, there was no car. Between that experience and some EVP we captured, there was no doubt that the bridge was haunted. But the next day I discovered that we weren't at the right bridge. Either way, there was something definitely paranormal going on at the bridge we ended up at. Fast forward to now, and my search for the area where Holly Blake's murder and cremation took place. Imagine my astonishment when I locate the wooded area on a map and realize that it's on the hill above the bridge that we were on. The woods surround the road leading to the bridge, and the bridge spans the Monocacy River, which is where James Van Meter deposited Holly Blake's remains, most likely right in the same area. Is that why the bridge seemed to be haunted? I don't really know, but it does explain the creepy, eerie, heavy feeling that we all felt while we were in the area. That's going to do it for this episode. Remember, you can find Lurk on all the podcast platforms like iHeartRadio, Apple, and Spotify. You can also find episodes on our website at lurkpodcast.com. Also on the website, you'll find our blog, links to social media, and the place where you can sign up for the newsletter. You definitely want to do that. If you like what you hear, tell everyone you know, and consider leaving us a 5-star review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or Facebook. And until next time, keep lurking. Also, maybe don't meet up with creepy guys at weird restaurants and drive off with them in their car. Don't do that. Don't do that.